support they had once given him and complaining bitterly about Grant. After days of fuming and writing, McClernand finally received a response from Lincoln, and to his shock and dismay, the president had somehow turned against him. There had been too many family quarrels among his generals, wrote Lincoln. For the sake of the Union cause, McClernand should subordinate himself to Grant. McClernand was crushed. He could not figure out what he had done or how it had all gone wrong. Bitter and frustrated, he continued to serve under Grant, but questioned his boss's abilities to anyone who would listen, including journalists. In June 1863, after enough negative articles had been printed, Grant finally fired him. McClernand's military career was over, and with it his dreams of personal glory. Interpretation. From the moment he met John McClernand, General Grant knew he had a troublemaker on his hands. McClernand was the type of man who thought only of his own career, who would steal other people's ideas and plot behind their backs for the sake of personal glory. But Grant would have to be careful. McClernand was popular with the public, a charmer. So when Grant figured out on his own that McClernand was trying to beat him to Vicksburg, he did not confront him or complain. Instead, he took action. Knowing that McClernand had an oversensitive ego, Grant recognized that it would be relatively easy to push the man's buttons. By taking over his subordinates' recruits, technically in his department anyway, while apparently covering his bases in the telegram, he forced McClernand into a rash response that seemed like insubordination to other military men and made it clear how far he was using the war for personal purposes. Once McClernand had rushed to take his troops back from Sherman, Grant stood aside. He knew that a man like this, vain and obnoxious, would irritate the hell out of his brother officers. They would inevitably complain about him to Grant, who, as a responsible officer, would have to pass the complaints upward, apparently without personal feelings in play. Treating McClernand politely while indirectly checkmating him, Grant finally got him to overreact in the worst possible way, with his letters to Lincoln and Stanton. Grant knew that Lincoln was tired of squabbling within the Union High Command. While Grant could be seen working quietly to perfect his plans for taking Vicksburg, McClernand was acting petty and throwing tantrums. The difference between the two men was all too clear. With this battle won, Grant repeated it, letting McClernand hang himself with his unwise complaints to the press. You will often come across McClernands in your daily battles, people who are outwardly charming but treacherous behind the scenes. It does no good to confront them directly. They are proficient at the political game. But a subtle one-up campaign can work wonders. Your goal is to get these rivals to put their ambition and selfishness on display. The way to do this is to pique their latent but powerful insecurities. Make them worry that people do not like them, that their position is unstable, that their path to the top is not clear. Perhaps, like Grant, you can take action that thwarts their plan in some way while hiding your own beneath a veneer of politeness. You are making them feel defensive and disrespected. All the dark, ugly emotions they strive so hard to hide will boil up to the surface. They will tend to lash out, overplaying their hand. Work to make them grow emotional and lose their habitual cool. The more they reveal of themselves, the more they will alienate other people, and isolation will be their doom. 2. The Académie Française, founded by Cardinal Richelieu in 1635, is a highly select body of France's 40 most learned scholars, whose task it is to oversee the purity of the French language. It was customary in the early years of the Academy that when a seat became empty, potential members would petition to fill it. But on the occasion of a vacant seat in 1694, King Louis XIV decided to go against protocol and nominated the Bishop of Noyon. Louis's nomination certainly made sense. The bishop was a learned man, well-respected, an excellent orator, and a fine writer. The bishop, however, had another quality as well, an incredible sense of self-importance. Louis was amused by this failing, but most in the court found it downright insufferable. The bishop had a way of making almost everyone feel inferior, in piety, erudition, family pedigree, whatever they had. Because of his rank, for instance, the bishop was accorded the rare privilege of being able to have his coach drive up to the front door of the royal residence, while most others had to get out and walk from the entrance doors of the driveway. One time the Archbishop of Paris was walking along the driveway when the Bishop of Noyon passed. From his carriage, the bishop waved and signaled for the archbishop to approach him. The archbishop expected him to alight and accompany him to the palace on foot. Instead, Noyon had the carriage slow down and continued his drive to the front door, leading the archbishop through the window by the arm, as if he were a dog on a leash, meanwhile chatting away superciliously. Then, once the bishop did get out of the carriage and the two men started up the grand staircase, Noyon dropped the archbishop as if he were nobody. Almost everyone in the court had a story like this one to tell, and they all nursed secret grudges against the bishop. With Louis's approval, however, it was impossible not to vote Noyon into the academy. The king further insisted that his courtiers attend the inauguration of the bishop, since this was his first nominee to the illustrious institution. At the inauguration, customarily, the nominee would deliver a speech, which would be answered by the Academy's director, who at the time was a bold and witty man called the Abbé de Caumartin. The abbé could not stand the bishop, but particularly disliked his florid style of writing. De Caumartin conceived the idea of subtly mocking Noyon. He would compose his response in perfect imitation of the bishop, full of elaborate metaphors and gushing praise for the newest academician. To make sure he could not get into trouble for this, he would show his speech to the bishop beforehand. Noyon was delighted, read the text with great interest, and even went so far as to supplement it with more effusive words of praise and high-flying rhetoric. On the day of the inauguration, the hall of the Academy was packed with the most eminent members of French society. None dared incur the king's displeasure by not attending. The bishop appeared before them, monstrously pleased to command this prestigious audience. The speech he delivered had a flowery pomposity exceeding any he had given previously. It was tiresome in the extreme. Then came the abbé's response. It started slowly, and many listeners began to squirm. But then it gradually took off, as everyone realized that it was an elaborate yet subtle parody of the bishop's style. De Caumartin's bold satire captivated everyone, and when it was over, the audience applauded, loudly and gratefully. But the bishop, intoxicated by the event and the attention, thought that the applause was genuine, and that in applauding the abbé's praise of him, the audience was really applauding him. He left with his vanity inflated beyond all proportion. Soon, Noyon was talking about the event to one and all, boring everyone to tears. Finally, he had the misfortune to brag about it to the Archbishop of Paris, who had never gotten over the carriage incident. The Archbishop could not resist. He told Noyon that the abbé's speech was a joke on him, and that everyone in the court was laughing at the bishop's expense. Noyon could not believe this, so he visited his friend and confessor, Père Lachaise, who confirmed that it was true. Now the bishop's former delight turned to the most bitter rage. He complained to the king and asked him to punish the abbé. The king tried to diffuse the problem, but he valued peace and quiet, and Noyon's almost insane anger got on his nerves. Finally, the bishop, wounded to the core, left the court and returned to his diocese, where he remained for a long time, humiliated and humbled. Interpretation. The Bishop of Noyon was not a harmless man. His conceit had made him think his power had no limits. He was grossly unaware of the offense he had given to so many people, but no one could confront him or bring his behavior to his attention. The abbé hit upon the only real way to bring such a man down. Had his parody been too obvious, it would not have been very entertaining, and the bishop, its poor victim, would have won sympathy. By making it devilishly subtle, and making the bishop complicit in it as well, de Caumartin both entertained the court, always important, and let Noyon dig his own grave with his reaction, from the heights of vanity to the depths of humiliation and rage. Suddenly aware of how people saw him, the bishop lost his balance, even alienating the king, who had once found his vanity amusing. Finally, he had to absent himself from court, to many people's relief. The worst colleagues and comrades are often the ones with inflated egos, who think everything they do is right and worthy of praise. Subtle mockery and disguised parody are brilliant ways of one-upping these types. You seem to be complimenting them, your style or ideas even imitating theirs, but the praise has a sting in its tail. Are you imitating them to poke fun at them? Does your praise hide criticism? These questions get under their skin, making them vaguely insecure about themselves. Maybe you think they have faults, and maybe that opinion is widely shared. You have disturbed their high sense of self, and they will tend to respond by overreacting and overplaying their hand. This strategy works particularly well